Well, why don't we pray? Spirit of God, sometimes opening these scriptures seems like an academic exercise, and to many people it is. But we know these scriptures as speaking something to us from you. So we'd ask that you will inspire our listening and our investigation. Let these scriptures challenge us to grow. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So last week, what we were working to do is to walk through the patriarchs. And if I were going to say there's one thing that the patriarchs are about, it's going to come down to Exodus 50, verse 20. That's at the end of the Joseph story. Now, we didn't talk about the Joseph story, but you know the basics, right? Jacob had all these kids through wives and slaves. And one of them, Joseph, was a favored one of Jacob's, and you can tell that because he didn't have a many-colored coat. He had a coat with long sleeves, and that meant that he didn't have to work. All right, he had a coat with long sleeves. You didn't have to work, and so his brothers were jealous, and they sold him into slavery. And then, through a series of things that happen, we find out that Joseph becomes second in command to Pharaoh in Egypt during a time when there's a famine, and then his brothers come to get food, thinking that Joseph is dead and gone or in slavery somewhere. His brothers come to get food, and Joseph reveals himself, and the story, I suppose, turns out well, which is to say that the whole family then, the family of Abraham, moves to Egypt where they are able to thrive. Okay? And in Exodus 50, verse 20, Joseph says to his brothers, "Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as God is doing today." The whole patriarchal cycle is about God promising and Abraham's family not getting it right. They just never get it right. All right? But that doesn't seem to stop God from doing what God wanted to do under the circumstances. What God wanted to do was to create a nation through whom all of the families and the nations of the world could be blessed. He wants to show the world what it looks like to be a people that are formed by the presence of God. Right? That's what it's all about for God. In chapter 12, verse 1, when God calls Abraham, it's all about, I'm going to call you to be a people so that you can reveal to the world around you what it's like to be a faithful group of people that are in touch with God. So even though all the patriarchs were scoundrels and difficult and a pain in the neck, and even Joseph, I mean, he was such a prig. I mean, doesn't he drive you crazy? He's just so perfect. Right? If he was my brother, he'd drive me nuts too. Okay? But even him, they get to this point, and God gets God's way at the end of the book of Genesis. God wants a numerous people, and sure enough, there are a numerous people in Egypt. They were thriving. Right? Then we move to Exodus. And I'm just going to say as an introduction that Exodus is the paradigm of a walk of faith for all of us. This is a book that, well, the whole Bible is really a book about you and your walk of faith. Right? But Exodus provides a paradigm for what it's like to interact with God, what's expected, right? And how we respond, and so on and so forth. There we go. So as the paradigm of faith, what happens is, at the very beginning of Exodus, there was a Pharaoh who was born who knew not Joseph. You remember at the end of Genesis, Joseph had a good relationship with Pharaoh. He was second in command. But then there's a change in dynasties, is really what most scholars think this refers to. And at the change of dynasties, we had a Pharaoh who was very jealous and afraid of the growing population of the family of Israel. All right? And so he enslaved the population, made life difficult for them. And that's the beginning of the book. So the question is, what does God do about that? Once God's people, he's gone to all this trouble to work with these scoundrels in Genesis and still has managed, let me admit somebody here, still has managed to have a numerous nation, the purpose of which is to show the world what it's like to be people that are faithfully in relationship to God. Okay? And now these people are enslaved, these people have hardship. The Pharaoh is making them work hard with very little resources. And so what happens? At the end of chapter 2, 23 to 25, after a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israels groaned under their slavery, and they cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. So in our life of faith, the first thing we know is that God takes notice of our condition. God hears us. God longs for us to be living close, and therefore God hears and God listens and then makes a move. All right. The first thing God does is he prepares somebody named Moses. All right. Moses is born at a time when all the baby boys are supposed to be killed, but somehow God finds a way, or Moses' mother finds a way, to have Moses be taken care of. All right? He's in a little ark, really. Pharaoh's daughter takes care of him, raises him, gives him an education. Until one day, Moses, who feels connected to his people, sees them being abused. He kills an Egyptian guard, and then in fear, he takes off and goes out into the wilderness. The wilderness is a place where God forms character, where God prepares people. All right? God did that with Jesus in the beginning of the Gospels. All right? And God is doing this with Moses. He prepares Moses for what will be Moses' work. Well, how? Moses becomes a shepherd. All right? I don't know how much you know about being a shepherd, but sheep are about the stupidest, most contrary animals on the face of the globe. All right? You learn how to work with sheep, you got a pretty good chance of working with human beings. I mean, sheep, in the middle of a snowstorm, they can be sheltered 20 feet away. All right? And sheep will die in the snow. They won't get into the shelter. All right? So they're dense, and Moses is trained or prepared for his work by God in the wilderness. All right? Which means that all of the things that happen with us, all the things that our life has contributed, that have contributed to our life, those things God uses when God wants to work through our lives. When I say this is a paradigm of our faith, I mean it's a direct comparison. Right? So, what are the things that we learn earlier in our life that we're able to use later? It's pretty remarkable. In my life, I was struck by the fact that I had to take a practical class in seminary called clinical pastoral education. At least at the time it was required. I hope it's not required anymore, but it probably is. It's to me a questionable program. I'm not sure you can do clinical pastoral education, but I did, and I did it at the Federal Mental Hospital in Washington, D.C. St. Elizabeth's, where John Hinckley was, and it's quite a place. If you've heard Sarah talk about her work over the years, it can be a terrifying place. It's a weird place. I could tell you stories. I don't think there's enough time, but I did work in clinical pastoral education there. My first call as a pastor, right, The first hospital call I made was to a 7-year-old boy in a locked psychiatric ward. Okay? And as I was driving the hour north to that hospital, my first hospital call as a pastor, I thought to myself, if I hadn't done CPE, I'd be scared right now. I'm not sure I would have had the courage to go. Right? But as it was, I knew exactly what I was getting into, what was going to happen, and so I just went up and dealt with it. That boy, 8 years later, became my foster son. So we prepare and we learn. Right? God prepares us. I mean, just take a moment. You don't have to tell me, but think about the things that you've learned, that you've done in the past, that God has been able to use in your life. And you can say if you want, but
Well, I definitely took the wrong path for many years, and you know, it had to get to a pretty grim place before I, was able to really ask God to help. And I had a lot of people that helped, and that was really great.
yeah. But what happened during those years that God is able to use now?
Well, I have something that I can share with other people that they can understand that, they're going through that type of situation. And, I can say what it was like and what it's like now. And it actually is hopeful for them because if I can do it, anybody can do it. That's
And there's
about
a
what it
lack of
comes down
judgment.
to.
There's also a lack of judgment that comes from that experience. You meet other people and you don't, necessarily look at them crosswise because you figure there, but for the grace of God go I,
Absolutely.
you know.
Yep. Always.
So it's just interesting to me that when I read this book, you see this interaction between God and people that is very relevant to our own lives. And so it would be interesting at some point to just do a journal entry for yourselves. Just write down what has happened to me in my life that I may have thought was a wrong turn, years ago, that God has been able to use to do God's work to express God's love into the world. It can be very encouraging, you know. Why did I waste years and years, if I indeed wasted them, being a securities engraver? You Reality is I use that skill all the time. Melody and I talked about it today. I set up a template to get the margins fixed on the bulletin. It was just kind of comes naturally to me. So it's one of the things that we expect. So God hears and God cares and God prepares us. All right, that's really the first two things that we learn. And then finally, God calls us. Now, what we're talking about here is Christian vocation. Every single person, every person, I'm going to mute Lena here. Every single person is called by God to live out their role to make the world a more beautiful and full place. There are no extras on the set here. Not a single one of you, right, is an extra that we don't need, that God doesn't need. My friend Mark talks about the puzzle piece Dharma. That God's work is a huge puzzle piece, and every single piece is important, so that within your sphere of influence, whatever it is, with your skills and the things that life has offered you, all right, it's your responsibility to live out your call, to do the things that you can do. You're not expected to do the things I can do. Somebody else can do. It really is all about figuring out what your call is, what it is that's important for you. You know, when you think about your vocation, how does that fit for you? I mean, is the work you do in the world something that you feel is a call from God, or where does your call fit in?
That I've tried 15 years ago.
Yeah, my mother would have called that spiritual maturity. That's something we grow, we really do grow into. One of my high school friends' dads was an executive at IT&T when that was a big deal, and he spent all his time either commuting or working, you know, and you know, he might show up at church 1 out of 5 Sundays, something like that. But when he retired, he immediately felt a call to do a great deal of work in the church, and that became his call at that point. You know, so there are different ways to listen, and it changes over time. So God prepares us, and God calls us. All right? And one of the interesting things about it is you can't ever be quite sure about God's call. It's one of the reasons that the Presbyterian Church insists that a call be validated. In other words, I could say, I think I'm called to ministry. But the church turned around and said to me, yeah, well, you might think so, but we're going to decide whether or not you're called to ministry. There's a discerning process that groups of people need to do together. All right? Because it's very difficult to tell. And Moses had a hard time. Moses received his call during that burning bush story. Remember? There's a burning bush. It wasn't consumed. And Moses goes over to it and he listens. And he has this discussion with the presence of God. Right? And God says, I want you to let my people go. All right? And they go back and forth. Moses says, no, I don't think I should. I don't see how I can. And I can't talk. I don't know how to talk. He argues back and forth with God about, nah, this isn't my call. This isn't my call. All right? And so God comes up with several ideas as to how to get around his objection. And Moses finally says, well, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. I got to tell you, that's not helpful. You know, I want some sort of proof that God is actually calling me to do something, and God says, well, you know, when you've succeeded, then you'll know I called you. That's a walk of faith. It's a step of faith. And the reality is that that's the nature of the way we live life with God. We don't know. Right? 20 chapters later, Moses is back on top of this same mountain. He has gotten the people out of Egypt. God has taken them. All right? And then he takes a step towards the promised land, into the wilderness and towards the promised land. That second step is different. The first step, it's like, well, this is a real blind faith thing. Okay, I'm going to give it a shot. All right? But once you've succeeded in God's call, once you've had that experience, all right, the next step, you got a little bit better sense. You say, well, okay, so God was there for me then, so I have more confidence that what I'm hearing now is what I need to hear. All right? So that's why I said earlier to Craig, there's a spiritual maturity that happens. It doesn't mean you know every time. I'm just saying that it's something that grows and develops. Exodus is a paradigm of a walk of faith. And the reality is, when you begin that walk, you don't know. It's why we need spiritual teachers. It's why we need people supporting us. It's why we need other people who are searching for God's call to talk to us and help us discern what's next. You know, and so Moses in chapter 3, he gets the word. Yeah, I'm calling you. You know, and you'll know I called you when you're back here and you've succeeded. And I just sort of chuckle. How does that feel? You know. Because it really feels like you're jumping off a cliff at a certain point. And that is the nature of a walk with God. You ever felt like you were jumping off a cliff with God? Anybody had that experience?
Not really, but I can imagine how he felt knowing that his adversary was the strongest government militarily in the entire region.
Yeah,
And here am I. Who am I, Lord?
right. So what's interesting when I ask this question in different settings, some people understand what it's like to jump off the cliff, and some people aren't quite sure what that's like. And the paradigm for that would be my mother and my father. Right? My mother said that when Dad went to seminary, for her that was like jumping off a cliff. All of a sudden, she was going to be a pastor's wife. She was terrified she was going to blow it, and hurt the ministry. That was her worst fear. As it turned out, if you read the minutes of the Elizabeth Presbytery, it says that the Reverend Julian Alexander founded the Willow Grove Presbyterian Church. And I tell people, don't you believe it? It was my mother that founded that church. He would have gotten nowhere without her. But she felt like she was jumping off a cliff where Dad was one foot in front of the other, careful and analytic. He wasn't going to jump anywhere. God works in different ways with people. For me, it feels like jumping off a cliff. But there are different ways that people respond and react to the call. The important thing is that we have a call. And it's something to discern. It's something to think about at every point in our life. So we walk by faith. So what are the other things that we learn about God and God's work in Exodus? Well, in chapter 13, first of all, God rescues us, right? There is some sense in which the movement of God in history takes us towards a point of justice and hope, right? Martin Luther King Jr. used to quote, I forget which hymn it was, but the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, right? That doesn't mean that God just makes everything work, but what it does mean is that over time, God leads and directs. God moves things and makes things happen. And the arc of the moral universe is long, but it does bend towards justice. There are moments when clearly there's a move of the divine that works in the world that makes things better and more whole. One could argue that the Berlin Wall coming down was such a moment. All right? There are moments when things seem to cohere. And the first dozen chapters of Exodus are about such a moment. They're about a moment when God's work in the midst of history, all right, takes these people and moves them out of oppression and into a moment of freedom. And one of the things God does is God does that in chapter 13, verse 21. The Lord went on in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them the light, so that they might travel by day and by night. Right? And neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. God leads and directs in the middle of our spiritual life. We have to pay attention to it. It's different in the day and different in the night. But there is a sense in which if we stay tuned to the presence of God, that we will hear God and be directed towards the future.
Question. I think it's a very profound question.
It is. So you brought up deism and theism. Okay? Deism is a God who's disconnected from the universe's story. or set things in motion and isn't really doing anything, isn't involved. Okay? Theism is God on the outside of creation, disconnected from creation, but acting upon it. Okay? I think there's a third. All right? And that is that God interpenetrates creation. Right? And there's a way in which it makes both deism and theism true. And I'll give you my example. I believe I was called to ministry. Right? A lot of people believe I was called to ministry, which is interesting. God called me to ministry. So when I was about to go to seminary, I was also about to get married to my first wife, and she had a little boy. And have I told you this story? I've told somebody this story recently. Okay. So she had a little boy who was, well, he was difficult. I was in the principal's office 3 or 4 times in September of his first grade year. He was impossible. So I thought what I would do is go and see a psychiatrist that I'd had in my late teens when I was in a suicidal depression. So I went to see him and just wanted to get some advice, some counsel about how to work with Benjamin. You know? And then I told him what I was about to do. I was about to go to seminary, and my doctor said, "Oh, you're not going to believe this." And he picked up his notes, and he went to the first page of notes from the first visit I had with him when I was 18 years old. And in the upper corner it said, "This young man will be in seminary by his mid-30s." Okay? Now, at some level, you say that's amazing. Well, actually, you know, he's a family systems guy. That was a no-brainer. You know, he knew I was going to have to resolve the tension and the difficulty with my parents, and he knew perfectly well the most logical way for me to approach that would be finally to come back to faith and then, like my father, become a pastor, and I could be, like my father, Jesus's first cousin. That's what my mother used to refer to my father as. You see the psychological damage that's done. so I had to come to grips with that. So why did I become a pastor? Well, family systems. I mean, it was the psychological pushes and moves and shifts that naturally moved me through creation's laws, natural work. That's why I became a pastor. But I'm going to tell you, that's true, and it's also true God called me to ministry. I'm sure of it. Right? Both those things are true at the same time. I don't think we have to have an either or. I think we can see God working. It's why I refer to God as creative urgency or evolutionary impulse. Because we watch creation unfold, and there's a creative dynamic that to me seems to be driving it forward. And I don't think about that dynamic as outside. I don't think of that dynamic as creation itself. There's an interpenetration, and so we can always see two sides of the coin as we're trying to discern how God leads. I absolutely believe that God leads the people. That's the paradigm of faith, and we need to look for it and listen for it. But sometimes the way we do that is we just look at the reality of our situation. We determine, Jack, where we're going to be happy, where our talents fit. You know,
Read something very challenging this week. It fits into that. Is God a noun or a verb?
Mm-hmm.
You're suggesting verb there.
You betcha.
Yeah.
I mean, that, you know, and one of the things that does is it removes the issue of science versus religion. I just eliminated that issue. But at the same time, I'm not suggesting that God is not involved. I'm just saying that God's pretty impressive. God works through the natural course of things. And to me, that's much more impressive than performing magic tricks, miracles that come in from wherever. The next thing that God offers us is a provision. Right? There's this wonderful story, God brings the people into the wilderness. God saves them at the Reed Sea by walking through the parted sea, and then the people start complaining. Oh, we never should have left Egypt. We don't have any food. So God's response to that is to provide manna. Okay, and the thing about the manna is that there's plenty of it. There's not an overabundance. There's just enough, right? And so what this tells me about a life of faith is that there's enough in this world. There's enough for you and enough for me. And when we live in that world where we're afraid that we don't have enough, that's when we start to act in ways that go counter to the Spirit of God, that go counter to that creative urgency that's drawing, and the way Paul put it, or whoever wrote Colossians put it, drawing all things together in perfect harmony. So when we operate like that, just assuming there's no abundance, that there's not enough, that's when we get into trouble. God shows them immediately in the wilderness that there's enough, but the enough comes regularly, one thing after another, and it comes every day. You get a double portion on the Sabbath, so you don't, or the day before the Sabbath, so you don't have to work on the Sabbath. There's all this that happens. That's the walk of faith. God provides. Then we come to Exodus chapter 20, and you're of course familiar with Exodus chapter 20. That's where God gives us God's law. So apparently God has rules or structure that God wants us to live by. But it's an interesting thing to me in this story. I think it's really important that the Ten Commandments are in Exodus chapter 20. Right? Because if the Ten Commandments were in Exodus chapter 1, the story would be different. The story would be God looked down on God's people, saw them suffering, he heard them suffering, and then said, I know, I'll give them 10 rules. If they follow them, then I'll save them. But that isn't what God did. God heard their suffering, God saved them, brought them into the wilderness, and then gave them 10 rules. These 10 rules, so to speak, the 10 Commandments, are there to help form a nation that is attuned to the work and the presence of God in the world. Because God's still all about forming a nation that will be able to bless all the families of the earth because they know how to live in harmony and peace with that creative urgency, that creative power that is our God. That to me is why, well, you've seen my email address. Grace comes first. Okay? Always comes first. Right? It came first with those, all those stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. We screw up and God gives us a little grace. Screw up, God gives us grace. We get to the Tower of Babel, we've screwed up again. God forms the nation of Israel. Grace always comes first. Not because we deserve it, then it wouldn't be grace. It comes first because it's God's nature. And that, to me, is what's exciting about a life of faith and what I read in these scriptures. I don't have to read the Christian scriptures to find out that God's grace comes first. Though I read about them in the Christian scriptures, it's thoroughgoing in Torah. It's thoroughgoing in the books of the Hebrew scriptures as well. That's why it's the same God. Grace comes first.
Pastor.
Yes.
So that's very Presbyterian. Are you suggesting it's also very Jewish? Is that a normally accepted?
Absolutely. Absolutely. God's grace comes first. I think that's thoroughgoing in the scriptures. I don't think it's just Presbyterian.
That's what I was asking. It's also Jewish?
I think you're hard pressed to move away from the nature of God as being described as grace comes first. Now that can mean a lot of things, but no, I think it's the nature of God as we read about God, because what's this book about? The book's about how God works with God's people. And every story I read seems to be that God offers creative love and urgency, no matter what it is that we do. Because God's in the business of creating a beautiful creation, moving to bring things together in perfect harmony. That's what God's about. And, you know, I actually, sometimes, as my friend Jesse would say, it feels like God's a bit of an underachiever on that. Because, you know, there's some things that I'd really like God to take care of right now. But it's not how it works. But I would have to say that, you know, as I've said before, 13.82 billion years from the Big Bang to Shakespeare, that's a trajectory. Don't know ultimately where it's going to take us, but on this planet, but it seems to be the nature of God and the nature of God's creation, be it on this planet or in the universe. It's what God's about. I mean, think about it. The universe has created people that can look at it and understand what it is and impact its creation now. We are conscious of that. And that's the movement and the work of God. And God appears to be calling us into this moment. But then God gives us law. And so I'm assuming you know there are basically two tables to this law. You know, the first table is love God. Okay, it's all about putting things right between you and the divine. That's what comes first, because once you are in proper relationship with the presence of God, well, then it really comes quite naturally for love to flow out to the people around you. So you love God, and that moves you to love people. And those two things do a little dance. That's what they're about. Have you ever done a study of the 20 Commandments of the 10 Commandments at Rockland? I'm sorry. Father Guido Sarducci. Remember the Padre? You know, he said that's why I told you there were 20 commandments from God. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, and what happened? You know what happened. I mean, by Moses, he goes up onto the mountain and he gets the 20 commandments from God. He comes down, the people, they are worshiping a bronze god, right? And so Moses gets mad and he smashes the tablets and he no longer has the 20 commandments, and he goes up to get 20 commandments from God again, but God wasn't there. And so Moses could only remember 10. The negative ones, you know, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery. You know, he missed the other 10. All right, you know, you don't go swimming until 20 minutes after you eat. And when he used to get you just to go around to the outside. So there were 20 commandments from God, even if it was a Freudian slip. But these commandments, they set up a kind of fence around this community, because this is all about forming a nation. That's really what God is about here. It's all about forming a people that will be able to bless all the nations of the earth, because they're going to show you, what does it look like to be a people of God? What does it look like to live in harmony with that creative urgency? Well, one of the things you do is you follow these laws. Of course, any law has to be interpreted, right? But that is the nature of it. So law then becomes another extension of God's grace. Instead of being the judgment of God, it's an offering and a gift of God. Because when you think about it, you had a group of people who were born into slavery for generation after generation, who were oppressed and hurting, and all of a sudden became free. How on earth will they know how to rule themselves? You know, being in slavery destroys communities. You don't have to look very far to know that. I mean, we can just look at the African American communities and what's happened to them over the last few hundred years, you know? And so God rescues God's people and gives them law so that they will be formed in a way that allows them to live in harmony with the presence of God. It's quite a gift. And the trick is really to interpret these commandments in light of the culture, you know, because if you look in Numbers and Leviticus, there are all kinds of ways you can interpret these commandments that don't make any sense at all for our time and place, but did make some sense when these documents were written. Do you ever read the Ten Commandments in worship out of curiosity? Back in John Calvin's day, you would do what we do in worship, was we have a prayer of confession, okay, and then we have words of assurance, right? But then there would be a reading of God's law. All right. Once we are a redeemed and saved people, then we receive the law and we're ready to hear about it. It's something we're hungry for at that point, because we don't want to stay in that place where we are just lost and unable to live the way we need to live. So that's God. God hears us and cares for us. God prepares Moses. God calls Moses, which requires a walk of faith. God leads the people. God rescues the people. God leads the people. God provides for the people a world of abundance, and God gives the people law so that they can live in harmony. Okay? But what do the people do? Well, the people, we've already learned, they complain, and they also reject God. All right. Moses goes up onto the mountain, chapter 32. He's up there a little too long. They get worried and they think, oh, we really, this isn't working out. We don't know if God's here. We don't know if God isn't here. So let's make the bronze god. Let's make the golden calf, and we'll worship that. Now, that was supposed to be an image of the real God. They weren't worshiping a calf, but it was an image of the real God that they were trying to put in place. And what was it made out of?
Gold.
It was made out of gold, right? Where did it come from? Oh, well, it was the Egyptians who gave the gold to the Israelites when they were leaving town after the Passover. And so they take this booty God has given them, and what do? They reject God and reject Moses' leadership, right? By making this golden calf. And what happens as a result? God comes down and punishes the people. So there's some punishment, there's some consequence for breaking God's law. One of the things that struck me about this passage for years is it seems so arbitrary. Who gets punished? All right, what is it? I'm forgetting the number because I never remember numbers. But in Exodus 32, we've got here we are. Because it was something like 1/7 of the people, or maybe 1 in 10. But it was like God said, so you got to kill a certain proportion of these people. There's a consequence. But it was so blasted random. How do we know which ones were there? Were there those people that had were those the people that had decided they wanted to make the golden calf? I don't think it was just. They were just random people in the community that had to be killed, right? And that, to me, is what life is kind of like. The consequences of breaking God's law do not necessarily fall on the lawbreakers. Have you noticed that? It's not how it works. And so you could ask yourself, is that just? And it's a fair question. My friend Eric wants to file suit with the Almighty. I'm sure he already has. Eric died several years ago. I can just picture him. Because the world doesn't feel like a just place. But it is how creation unfolds. And so, what does happen to the people who bear the brunt of the judgment and the consequence of breaking the laws of God? What happens? I have to go back to the nature of God and suggest that there are no extras. God doesn't waste anything, and there is a something at the end of life. I don't know what it is. Heaven was an idea we came up with, somewhere towards the end of the nation of Israel, around the Persian Empire. Heaven and hell don't really make it into the scriptures until the later layers of the later layers. So it's not like it's thoroughgoing. So is there a heaven? I don't know. I'll call it a poetic heaven, but there is some sense that God's grace always comes first, and it's in God's nature to love and to move us past death into new life. And that's maybe what I like best about the clarity of the New Testament, of the Christian scriptures, that it's so clear. We move from death into new life. Everything does. It's the nature of God's creation. This is what happens. And it happens when things falter and fall, when things do not unfold in a way that is in harmony with the creative urgency of God. So we reject God, and as a result, humanity suffers consequences, the creation suffers consequences, but in the end, what I believe is that God brings new life from that destruction. Now, of course, these texts were written in a much more violent time, when arbitrary killing, when life frankly meant less, individual life meant less. These texts, even in the Christian scriptures, they're really focused on community. They're not worried about individuals. That's our particular 20th century focus. We worry about me. And it's not fair to me. It's not fair. While God's more concerned, obviously, with the whole picture, not the individual picture. And I don't particularly like that. That's my little rebellion with God. I understand when people object. The two reasons that I hear over and over again that people leave the church or don't want to come. Right? One, God allows suffering, and two, all Buddhists go to hell. Those are the two that really bug people, and both of them have to do with justice. What's right and what's wrong, how God moves in the world. And as I said earlier to Jack, I don't see a theist God that does these things, that allows or disallows suffering. I see an interpenetrating God that is working in a world that is not yet complete and unfolding. And in that world, there is suffering. And what does God do when God sees suffering, when God sees consequence for the breaking of God's law? Well, God seeks to heal it and bring about the next beautiful thing. That, to me, is what our God is all about. It's what this text is all about, because God's grace comes first. The other consequence of the golden calf is the people have to spend 70 years in the wilderness. So they're not ready to form a nation. They're just not ready to make the promise happen. And so they end up in a situation where they got to live in the wilderness for a lot of years so that God can form the nation, form the character of it, develop a faithful people who can learn how to attend to the presence of God, to follow the pillars, and listen in faith for vocation, to do all of those things. And that's what our life is like. Ever been in the wilderness? Well, I'll tell you, I mean, there are many ways. The letter I wrote in the Rockville Word this time is saying this. I feel strongly about my brief call here that this is about helping this church thrive during COVID, not just get by. I really don't think we have to just get by. Perfectly placed. This church is ready. You've got good fellowship. You have resources to do it. You know, people are together. It's a healthy congregation. And we can thrive during this time. And that doesn't mean I don't want to go back to the way things were. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that as long as we can't, let's embrace it and make things happen. That's what I'm hearing, Spirit. And of course, you know, it's not enough for just me to be thinking that. Not enough. You know, the rest of the leadership has to say, yeah, that makes sense. Or not. It's going to be an interesting walk over the next few months.